You can feel it in a lot of parts of the country, sewn into the fabric of these midterms, venom and a sense of foreboding and danger. Maybe it was the 18 cases of suspected voter intimidation in Arizona, including armed right-wing activists in masks and camo garb watching over secure ballot boxes, or similarly, the 14 instances of potential intimidation or interference in North Carolina. That's according to Reuters. Maybe it is the fact that 45% of Republicans are not feeling confident that votes will be counted accurately, thanks to a lie spread by the ex-president and absent any evidence that that happened, ever. Or maybe it's the latest urgent warning from elections officials in battleground states that bad actors on the right could exploit holy standard delays in the way we count our votes in order to cast doubts on the integrity and accuracy of the ultimate results. The Justice Department this afternoon, seemingly determined to control things that can still be controlled in our country, moved to mitigate some of the potential for danger. The department released a list of 64 jurisdictions in 24 states in which it will monitor compliance with federal voting rights laws. But still, it is hard to shake that feeling, that worry, that tomorrow and thereafter could hold some degree of risk for some of our fellow citizens around this basic thing that we do in America, vote. Let's bring into our coverage Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence and an MSNBC National Security Analyst. Frank, I don't want to ask you to paint this with a broad brush, so just take me through what you're watching and what your concerns are.
My greatest concern is, aside from the obvious of monitoring extremist chat rooms and seeing what's going on there, and there's some good news there. There seems to not be this kind of chatter that looks like mass violence is planned, but there's certainly chatter. My main concern is whether or not local and county and state law enforcement is prepared, not just for tomorrow, which would be the obvious thing, and DHS and FBI have warned us that, yes, around the election, we have soft targets and access and exposure, voters standing in long lines and candidates still out there doing their thing. But rather, I think there's so many contests, Nicole, that can go into overtime here. And I think my advice to law enforcement at all levels would be, don't breathe that sigh of relief if after tomorrow you get through it and there's no major incident, but rather prepare for the more contentious vote counting that goes on for a day or two or three and becomes more and more tense. And start, if you haven't already at the local, county, and state level, law enforcement should have already briefed up election workers. Election workers should have a law enforcement point of contact on their speed dial. All of that should be coordinated. District attorneys should be ready to charge local offenses. U.S. attorneys, I know, in every single district federally are coordinated with identified FBI agents who are appointed as election crime coordinators. Every field office, the FBI has already put out a public notice on social media saying, here's how you get a hold of us if someone's trying to stop you from voting, interfering from voting. So my advice is the long haul. In some places, this is going to be a long count. Be prepared for it. Be prepared for overtime, as I said. That's where I get concerned about more organized crowd violence against the vote counters and the places where the vote counting is happening.
I mean, Frank, so as you're talking, I'm thinking of Shaye Moss and Ruby Freeman, who on election day, the disinformation and the images of them hadn't circulated to the degree that it would. And we all know now that they were hunted. They were chased from their home. Miss Ruby was told she couldn't go home. The FBI moved her out of her house. How do we protect these workers in these kinds of contests you're describing that could go on for days? Do they get preemptively assigned security? Is that enough?
I hope, first of all, that certain security measures taken in many places after we experience things like Fulton County, Georgia, are helping. So in many places, for example, there's only one law enforcement official. Where I live, it's the head constable who has the key to the lockbox with the votes in it. The odds of it being exposed to wrongdoers is far more mitigated. But there already needs to be a plan. It's almost too late, but they can still do it to actually reach out to the election workers, the officials, and make sure they have addresses. You know, they have prioritized police response. They have drive-bys of those people's residences. That needs to be happening. There needs to be that comfort level that the responders are going to be there and they're going to do the right thing.
You know, I'm reluctant to cover this story because I think the fear is the point. I hope nothing happens, but I think the possibility that something could is the point on the right. I think being out there with their cameras and their video monitors, that is the point, to make you scared. And I think there are open questions about whether creating this climate of fear around voting, making sure you're not registered, you know, where you went to college and where you now live, or at your parents' house, and you know, I think we'll have to find out afterward whether the voter intimidation, whether the, you know, hardening and the carrying around of you know, guns and dressing up like Halloween in their camo had an effect on turnout.
Well, I think the early vote shows that, at least on the Democratic side, that a whole lot of people are energized about voting. I mean, we are seeing numbers that you typically don't see in a midterm.
Higher than 18, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great.
Which I remember that year, by the way.
Me too. I think we were, yeah.
It was a rough one for me.
Yeah.
But
I just think we were covering it, but I stopped myself. Yes, right. Of course you remember.
So and here's the thing I want to say to everyone. Remember, fear is the point.
Right.
Don't let them get you to be afraid. I know how these elections are run, and I was a local prosecutor, and we put local prosecutors on speed dial, and we were coordinated, and we were out and looking at the various polling places. We had a hotline that people could call. There is a lot of organization around security, particularly now. So the worst thing you can do in America is not vote, because the Republicans have somehow convinced you with some losers in a mask and a camo gear and a big gun that you don't have a right to go have your voice heard. This election will be decided on that, really literally on the edge of a knife.
Yeah.
There are so many states right now, based on my conversations today, that the elections will be decided by less than a half a point.
Right, and maybe what happens tomorrow?
Maybe
Who shows up
votes.
tomorrow? Right.
Maybe. So anybody who's thinking, or has a grandmother or an aunt or someone who's, you know, well, I think they're out there with guns, I don't want to go vote. You've got to take them by the hand and say, no, we don't do this in America. Nobody scares us away from the polls. We've fought too hard for this democracy. I feel so strongly that if they get away with intimidating voters by these losers, then we're in more trouble than I think we are.
To Claire's point about how it's tightened up, I talked to people out in Pennsylvania and Michigan who said that it feels better. This weekend felt better than last weekend, and that what seems to have changed is what Claire's talking about, enthusiasm and perhaps some of this late vote.
Yeah, look, I think Democrats have leaned into the turnout model, and they have to, right? What we're talking about, though, is prima facie intimidation, voter intimidation.
Right.
You have voter suppression through laws and other mechanisms, but this is straight up voter intimidation. And Figliuzzi is exactly right. I just want to point out, it's amazing Figliuzzi lives in a town that still has a constable. By the way, not many towns still have that. But look, this is 2022, and this is an election where the courts have told us you're not allowed to share a bottle of water with a voter, but you can greet them with an assault weapon. I mean, that should send shivers down our spine.
The court didn't say that. The legislature said that. The court just said.
Well, no, the courts have tested both. Like,
yeah, that's right.
But the
That's true.
courts have affirmed both, and this also ties into the big lie. And listen, I went through an exercise actually with Jonathan Allen of NBC recently. What is the real import of the big lie? Is it just that we're electing ignorant people who refuse to acknowledge the truth? And it's deeper than that, because if you are told that your vote in 2020 did not matter because the election was stolen, the election was rigged, well, then the satisfaction of that grievance cannot happen at the ballot box in 2022. Because your franchise has no integrity to it. So now you have to lean towards intimidation and suppression and violence. That's why we saw, as a correction, that's why we saw January 6th. That's what we're seeing now.